Hello and welcome to the Beyond the Incident Forum. My name is Tanya Ha. I'm a science journalist and a sustainability researcher, and I'm delighted to be your host for this webinar. The Beyond the Incident Forum is part of a suite of online forums that are being held as part of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project. Now, a brief overview of today's forum. The focus is on broad multi-agency management coordination beyond the pointy end of immediate incident management. We'll soon start with an introductory video, followed by three research presentations and discussion with a lead end user. Along the way, there'll be online polls and opportunities for discussion. Now, for those of you who are new to this online environment, I'll quickly introduce the space that we're in. The main parts are self-explanatory. The research presentations will appear in the middle of the screen as a slideshow, and on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the research presenters. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see, importantly, at the bottom left-hand corner, there's a dialogue box. This is where that you can post your comments and your questions to researchers as the forum progresses. And this webinar is all about audience participation and you getting the understanding and answers that you want, so do contribute to the discussion. Now, do note that our voices are coming via phone lines and vision is coming via the internet. Now, this is done for optimal clarity and bandwidth, but it does mean that what you see and what you hear might not quite be in sync. Now, that's not a technical difficulty or mistake, it's just the nature of this online environment. But if you are having other technical difficulties, we do have the help hotline, which is 1-800-733-416. That's 1-800-733-416, and tech support will assist. The forum today will be recorded and it will be available at a later date on the Bushfire CRC website. So if you do have colleagues that you think might have benefited from today's presentation, do let them know to visit the website at a later date. Our last Research to Drive Change forum on the impacts of sleep disruption, smoke and heat exposure on firefighters is now available online too. Now, thank you to the people who've already sent in questions. We'll be addressing those during today's proceedings. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers that you'll be hearing from today. The researchers we're going to hear from are Dr Christine Owen from the University of Tasmania, Dr Chris Bearman from CQ University, Dr Ben Brooks from the University of Tasmania, and our acting lead end user is Geoff Conway, but we're going to hear more from them shortly. First up, we're going to hear a brief video that the Bushfire CRC has produced, which introduces the research you're going to hear about, and you'll also see the researchers and the lead end user you'll hear from today. So we'll now see the video.
We believe there's even some people being trapped down in there as well.
Most of the previous work that's been done looking at fire and emergency management has been focused very much on what happens at the sharp end, so on a fire ground or on an incident ground working with a flood. But no one had actually looked at what happens above the incident management team, despite the fact that it's a really complicated and complex emergency response system.
It's a complexity that is really outside the realms of understanding for your average person who walks down the street. It's both complex and there's a significant opportunity to get it wrong. That means that the system that we put in place around people to support them has to be really robust.
Teams essentially start with the situation awareness. They have a common situation awareness that they share with other team members. So the team builds its understanding of that situation. The next stage is the plan formulation. They form an intention to act. They form a plan about what they want to do as a team. And finally, they execute those plans. They carry them out and put them into action. And then that plan execution forms into the understanding that the team has, and it forms a cycle. It forms a cycle of activity. What can happen is that if you get a disconnect in the team situation awareness, for example, that can cause problems for the other stages of the team activity. So if you have a disruption to that team situation awareness, that can disrupt the plans that the team forms, and then it has an impact on the way in which those plans are executed. And what can happen is that as you cycle through that team activity, you get increasing divergence of the team's understanding, the planning, the execution. And because it's cyclical, that creates greater and greater problems. Now, as disconnects and breakdowns serve to disrupt that team's performance, what happens is that they start to slide towards the safety boundaries.
Emergencies throw up such unexpected things that you end up outside the boundaries of the system. And we coined the term coping ugly, which came from a guy called George Bonanno in the United States. And coping ugly is, the quintessential, you break up with your boyfriend and you're watching sad movies and eating Tim Tams. It's not necessarily a good dietary advice, but it gets the job done and gets you through. Well, there's coping ugly in emergency management as well. And what we've got to understand is that emergency management organisations will spend a lot of time outside the safe boundaries of that system. And what do we do about that? How do we then organise the system to recognise that you're going to be outside those boundaries?
The environment that we have to work in, whether it be the natural environment or the environment that we've built, either physically or socially, has substantively changed. And social media is a classic example of that. 20 years ago, an incident controller didn't need to worry about the fact that people within the community had better intelligence than they did. It wasn't the case. So there is a very clear understanding that emergency management and incident management as a component of that needs to keep pace with how society is evolving. And certainly the research is a critical part of that.
There's a fundamental difference in the demands that are placed on people who work at a state level in both content and context. And the context part is the most important. When the place is humming and there's lots on, that's happening because we have events that are high profile. They are major events that are likely to attract increased media attention and increased political attention. One of the key issues is to recognise that they are a different set of demands in both content and context, and therefore that has implications for training, and it also has implications for awareness training and supporting people who might be coming in from other agencies who are working in this room. There are also issues about the need for developing a political acumen, and I think it needs to continue to be looked at in terms of the tension between operating procedures and knowing how we're going on the one hand, and flexibility and innovation on the other. And I think that's actually the next area that really does need some more work.
This is one of our fundamental responsibilities, that when an event occurs, we understand the nature of it, we have an approach to resolving it, and we do that effectively. This research helps us understand how we organise to do that and what the critical aspects are in preparing people for that role. It's a fundamental piece of what we do, and we've got to do it well.
To the research presentations themselves, we're just going to get a quick gauge of what people's current level of knowledge is about these issues. We're going to do a quick online poll. So that poll will appear on your screen. Tell us, how much do you think you understand about multi-agency emergency management coordination at regional and state levels? Nothing, a little, a fair bit, or a lot? Okay, and we'll leave it for a few seconds longer. And we'll leave it there. So it shows that there is a good bit of understanding out there in the audience, but we hope you might learn something new from today's presentations and give greater depth to that understanding. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first research presenter, which is Dr Christine Owen from the University of Tasmania. And she's presenting on opportunities and challenges for the future with effective strategic level emergency management. And a reminder, there is that question box at the bottom of the screen. Do post your comments and questions for Christine as she presents her research. Take it away, Christine.
Okay, thank you, Tanya. It was in 2011 at the AFAC conference when the then president of AFAC, Commissioner Lee Johnson, observed that the work of the front line of incident management was well supported by AIMS and that the terrain of the kind of challenges that people face were also pretty well known. What he suggested in that, and has indicated in this slide, is that what we need to better understand and have been looking at over the past few years is what happens above that tactical and operational level. In fact, he went on to say that the information needs from political leaders, the demands faced at a strategic level to support other broader disaster operations and whole of government strategy were in fact crushing people working in AIMS and at an incident management level. And what we really needed to understand was more about those kinds of challenges and demands. And that's basically what this project has been about for the past 3 years. The kinds of questions that we've been examining have been starting right from the basics. How, in what ways might a local tactical incident management level be different at a strategic level? Are they different at all? Some people suggested that they weren't. We're also interested then in trying to understand more of the nature of the work that people do at a strategic level. And I want to stop here and just clarify that we're not suggesting that people who work at a regional and a state level, and indeed even a national level, might be the only people who are engaging in strategic thinking. That isn't what it's about. People who operate on the front line at a tactical incident management level, other people engaged in emergency management as stakeholders are all engaged in thinking strategically and needing to make strategic decisions. But we've termed the people who work at that regional, state or indeed national level as operating at a strategic level because they are involved in trying to service this other set of demands related to consequence management, whole of government, indirect effects and so on. And we can't also ignore that the demands of, say, the political leaders involved. So basically, what I've done here is I've summarised 4 of the research findings. So I just want to point out that on the Bushfire CRC website, there are a range of deliverables and reports. So if you have any interest in these, please go there because you'll find more detail. But in short, the principal members of the research team would like to highlight these 4 findings. The first is that there is, in fact, a strong difference in terms of the kinds of activities that go on at a strategic level. It is different than local incident management, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. The second is that we now also have a better understanding of the types of complexities facing people who work in this domain. And the third is that there's a serious gap which has been attended to recently, both in the industry and from a research perspective, on trying to better understand how the industry itself will define and measure its progress and success in emergency management. And finally, there's a need for attention to professional development capacity, both within and between teams who work at local and tactical levels as well as at strategic levels. So in terms then of some of the findings that were discussed briefly in that video, we know in terms of the differences between local and strategic levels that it's when events start to become non-routine and cascading, escalating up, that we typically get state and national and regional levels involved, that the focus at a strategic level is then on thinking about the broader consequences of these particular events, that it's going to involve national and state level of political interest. There'll be a higher level of media attention. The focus for people working at a strategic level is also going to be longer, and they're going to be considering the indirect effects of these particular events, such as kind of impacts on regional economies or tourism, for example. They're going to need to start to think about where they're going to service the demands on the ground, particularly when those resources might be depleted. So they're starting to think about interstate and international resource engagement. There's a concern about the reliability of the whole system, not just about whether things are being forwarded on in terms of information, but whether the teams working are working appropriately, and hence there's a focus on whole of government. In terms of the second point about understanding better about the drivers of complexity, we know that critical lifelines such as infrastructure are important, and these get increased attention operating at a strategic level. We also understand that there's considerable concern about the other end of emergency management in terms of response, to be thinking at a whole of government level about how things like disaster reduction strategies in place so that we don't have people needing to face these kinds of conditions. We know that in terms of complexity, there are increasing numbers of media and information flows, and that sometimes the traditional ways of getting messages out might not be timely. We also know that within communities there's an increased urbanisation, and that might make some parts of the population increasingly vulnerable, and as I've said before, there's this increased political attention, and that these elements all impact on the information flows between the local incident management and a state level of engagement. So that's the second point. The third point actually came up based on the work that we did in 2011 and 2012, when we were asking people in the industry how they thought success was measured. And I know that there's been a question on this that's come through, and I draw attention then to this particular slide, because what it suggests is that within the industry there's a lot of concern about the degree to which agencies themselves have effective evaluation mechanisms, and that in this case there were only less than 1 in 5 people had criteria that they mentioned that they thought gave the agency some sense of how progress and success might be measured as it was unfolding. But in the workshops, when we took these findings through and discussed them some more, we found out that there is a broad perception that performance is fundamentally measured after the event by the media and is done externally. And I know that there's a lot of interest both within the industry and in the project that we're now continuing on with in trying to unpack this a little bit more. Some of the research outcomes that you will find if you look on the website include some guides for supporting multi-agency coordination, particularly in terms of how centres might support emergency services liaison officers. There's guides in terms of considering the various changes that are happening and what that might mean for activity. There's a resource guide for regional managers that Chris is going to talk about in a second, And there's also some work on how we might support learning from after-action reviews that as the basis, or as an outcome rather, of some of the work that Ben will talk about as well. For example, in terms of how at a state level emergency services liaison officers might be supported, this is the work of Steve Kernan. Just some suggestions for people to be thinking about in the moment when these large-scale events are happening, so that people, other stakeholders who don't typically work in that particular centre might be engaged. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Christine. Actually, it's interesting, even just that simple point of, do people have passwords for the IT? It's these things that sometimes aren't thought of. I want to start off by asking, and a reminder to the audience, do send through your own questions. Again, it's that bottom left dialogue box that you can type your questions into. But what were the difficulties in undertaking the research?
Well, we faced a number of challenges, and in part those challenges came from not having a really good fix on the terrain. A lot of the work that's happened at a strategic level, and even the development of roles and responsibilities that might guide what happens in regional and state centres, has actually come based on the work of AIM. So there's been a lot of, as incident control systems in Australia have grown, then what that's meant is there's been some, not so much duplication, but a mirroring of various roles and responsibilities that happen at a local incident level. And so part of the issue was actually to tease out what some of these subtle but sometimes fundamental differences might be when we're using a language that works very well at a local incident level and might not necessarily mean the same kinds of things at a strategic level. So we've worked our way through those, and we've done so, I think, by having active consultations with the industry, and I thank Geoff, Conway and Liam Fogarty for their help here, just to make sure that we were on the right track and to regularly engage in feedback.
Yeah. We had a question sent through from Sophia before the forum. She's asked, what strategies can the major incident coordination team use to stay out of operations and to keep that strategic focus?
Well, yeah, that's actually a very good question. And it's one thing that came up a lot in our interviews, particularly at a local level, incident level, when people were quite frustrated by that level of sometimes interference. And I think we actually need to understand something about where that might come from. And in part, that focus then that people revert back to an operational understanding comes in part because they're under pressure and that's what they're comfortable with, that's what their experience has been. Typically that's what their training has been in, and so they revert back to that in part because that's what they know. And so they start trying to manage it as if they're working at that local incident level. And so one of the things that, as I mentioned before, in terms of findings, is that there is a great need for attention to training at a strategic level, in part because the people operating in those regional and state centres are typically still operating on the incident management training that they might have received for a local level, and might, in fact, and in many cases is even 5 years old. And if you think about how AIMS itself has changed over the past 5 years, people have been engaged in that at a practical level, but sometimes don't yet have the opportunity to actually step back and be thinking about what this means at a systems level. So I think taking on board that second slide that I had up about those differences and ensuring that people operating at a strategic level are focused on thinking more about the whole of government, indirect effects, the consequence management, what this might mean for a much longer time frame, well, in training and developing some triggers around those things, will help everybody.
Yes, I did notice that. That was an excellent slide, and a reminder to the audience that the presentations will be available online at a later date, so it's well worth revisiting them. Thank you, Christine. We'll leave it there and move on to our next research presentation. So thanks for your input. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our second research presentation. Dr Chris Bearman from the Appleton Institute at Central Queensland University is now going to present on breakdowns in coordinated decision making. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Tanya. Hello everybody. So I'm going to talk to you today a bit about the research that we've done on breakdowns in coordinated decision making. But first, I think we need to identify what a breakdown is. And here's a video that I found on the internet which quite neatly describes a breakdown.
Again, this is the USS Montana requesting that you immediately divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Over.
Please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid collision.
This is Captain Hancock. You will divert your course. Over.
Negative, Captain. I'm not moving anything. Change your course. Over.
So, this is the USS Montana, the second largest vessel in the North Atlantic Fleet. You will change course 15 degrees north, or I will be forced to take measures to ensure the safety of this ship. Over.
This is the lighthouse, mate. It's your call. Hello?
Okay, so breakdowns can have some quite embarrassing consequences then. So we can formally define a breakdown as a failure in coordination, cooperation, or communication that leads to a temporary loss in the ability to function effectively. And within those breakdown situations, what we find is that there's kind of sub-breakdowns, or what we call disconnects, which are the individual instances of disagreement between participants. So breakdown situations commonly have multiple disconnects within them. And when we looked at the data in more detail, what we found is that there's typically three types of disconnect. There's operational disconnect, informational disconnect, and evaluative disconnect. So an operational disconnect then is this notion that there is a difference in plans. So we can formally define that as a difference between the actions of one party and the actions expected by the other party. So that notion of plans then and people doing unexpected things, or a mismatch in the plans that each party has about the physical operation of the response. Informational disconnects, the second of the three types of disconnects. The informational disconnects are a difference in the information that each party possesses. And in the example that I showed you, the video, there's clearly a lack of information that one of the parties is in fact a lighthouse and probably isn't going to move too far. So there's that lack of information. That is an informational disconnect. And finally, we have evaluative disconnect. And an evaluative disconnect is a difference in the evaluation or appraisal of information that's available to both parties. So both parties have the same information, but they disagree about the interpretation or the evaluation of that information. So three main types of disconnects there. And when we look at the resolution of the disconnects, in any complex system, disconnects and breakdowns will occur from time to time. That's part of interacting in these complex environments. But what we do need to do is to resolve these things quickly and effectively. Now, we looked at three large-scale bushfires that happened in Australia over the last 10 years, and we looked at the way in which the disconnects within those breakdowns were resolved. And what we found is that about 10 out of 11 evaluative disconnects were resolved, 5 out of the 32 operational disconnects were resolved, and 3 out of 41 informational disconnects. So you can see then that the operational and informational disconnects are being resolved a lot less effectively than the evaluative disconnects. And I can offer up some thoughts about that later if you'd like to ask me a question. So given that we're finding quite low rates of resolution of disconnects in some of the larger bushfires, what we wanted to do was to create something that people could use in order to resolve or identify these things in more effectively. And this is an aid memoir that we produced for people at strategic levels. And it's things like missing information. Are you confident you have the right information about the incident? Obviously, you can't have as much information as you would like at that level, but is the information consistent? Is it contradictory? Are you getting the same request from the same person? Is the feedback that you're getting, have you received confirmation that the tasks that you delegated have been completed? This is something that we saw come up reasonably often in the data, is that tasks would be given, but there wasn't a confirmation that they'd been completed as expected. Intuition is always an interesting one. Does your gut tell you that something isn't quite right about that situation? If your gut's telling you there's something wrong, it's important to follow that up. Familiarity, is somebody familiar to you not behaving in the manner you've come to expect? And finally, ambiguity. What indicators are there that people know their roles and what they'll be doing in the near future? So resolution strategies then. So it's important not only to identify them, but to act to resolve them. And at strategic levels, often you have to work through other people. So things like delegating is important. Delegating the responsibility for somebody who has the ability to sort out that problem. Providing extra resources, that can sometimes fix the issue. Mentoring, providing suggestions, providing advice. As we work down the list, these become more interventionist, I guess. Asserting, which is about telling people how the world should be. Finally, replacing people within that system who are providing disruption, which is a somewhat extreme act and needs to be managed quite carefully, but can be a way of resolving those breakdowns. And finally, then networking and ensuring that all of the network understands disconnects and breakdowns and what they are. So the research outcomes from this component then, firstly, we created this language to talk about the components of breakdown. Instead of thinking of breakdowns as being one thing, we've managed to deconstruct that in order to identify these three components. And the three components need to be resolved in different ways. So it's important to be able to specify which things are breaking down. Methods to identify breakdowns, which has been produced in this aid memoir. And finally, the strategies to resolve breakdowns. And it might seem, excuse me, it might seem somewhat self-evident in a webinar setting that these things are what you need to do to identify and resolve breakdowns. But in the more extreme fires that we see, these things can actually drop out. And it's important to be able to go back to something and say, what should I be doing in this situation? How can I avoid these disconnects? And also for more novice people coming through into those roles, it can be important to think about some of these things. Thank you very much. Tanya.
Thanks, Chris. And a reminder to the audience, you can type in your questions in the bottom left-hand dialog box on the screen. So if you do have questions for Chris, do send them through. But first off, I wanted to find out, why do you think that the resolution of operational and informational disconnects is so low?
In bushfire and emergency management more generally, what we see is that there's lots of different ways of resolving something. There's lots of different plans that you can form. And often we're working without all the information we would like. So it's not always clear that we don't have the information or that people have formed plans that are inconsistent with those that we have. So I think it's part and parcel of working in that more complex environment. When we look at different domains, what we see is a different pattern of resolution. So in aviation and air traffic control, for example, the operational and informational disconnects are resolved much more effectively. And that's because it's a more structured, proceduralized environment. So the reason they're not being resolved so much in the bushfire domain is because it's less strongly proceduralized and probably a more dynamic situation.
So that's is that one of the things that's unique to the bushfire situation compared, say, with other natural hazards? What kind of breakdown sort of are similar and different in different emergency situations?
Attention in the building, the following tones are test. The following tones are test.
Oh, sorry about that. We seem to be having a fire alarm drill, so I do apologise if that's very loud in the background. I'm sorry, could you say your question again? I couldn't.
Yes, it was picking up on what you were saying. It sounded like there are some things that are quite unique to the bushfire situation. Do you find the same results with other natural hazards? You know, what things are unique, what things are different for bushfires compared with other emergencies?
Right, okay. One of the new pieces of research that we're doing is to explore some of these things in other natural hazards. I'll just mute my...
We might just leave it there, Chris, and if we have time, we'll pick up some questions with you later. We'll have to leave it there. We'll move on to our third research presentation. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our third researcher, which is Dr. Ben Brooks from the University of Tasmania. He's going to present on opportunities and challenges for the future with effective strategic level emergency management. And we'll keep the question and answers fairly short and see if we can bring Chris back at a later time. But for now, take it away, Ben. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Tanya. I'll just turn this microphone up a little bit. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming online today. And I wanted to talk about the system of emergency management in the context of the research that we've done. So I think it's fair to say that emergency management is different to a whole lot of other high-risk work environments. And one of the reasons for that is that what we might do in aviation or rail or healthcare is try and manage a system so that it is managed within the bounds of safe operations. And the middle circle in this particular diagram essentially identifies that space, a safe space of operations in which we set up our system to proceduralise those particular issues. But in emergency management, one of the problems is that emergencies don't necessarily run the way that we might like them to. And this very fact that they're emergencies, that they operate in very dynamic and sometimes even chaotic environments, leads us to a scenario where we end up in a zone that's outside the safe space of operation. And so, as it says there, the system itself is therefore regularly degraded. And so outside the safe space of operation might mean that communication systems collapse. It might mean that we're fatigued. It might mean a range of different things. It's also fair enough to say that in bushfires and indeed in other emergency management environments, there's an incredible level of complexity. And so if we understand this and recognise that it's true, a way forward in both training and operations is to make the boundaries between safe and unsafe action explicit and to develop coping skills at those boundaries. And this is partly because we are regularly outside the boundaries, and it's partly because of the complexity, which leads to the need for quite simple approaches, simple and flexible approaches. And so we've coined this term coping ugly, and as you saw in the video earlier on today, coping ugly is a term that is really about understanding what it's like to operate outside that safety space. And we can break this down a little bit more because it's nice to have a term that everyone can perhaps agree with or at least understand. But what does that actually mean? And when we think of emergency management in the context of coping, what usefulness does that provide us with? And the first thing is that the coping literature gives us some indication of what sort of repertoires, what we can actually do to respond to those stressful situations. And we can change the situation in some way. we can change what it means and get into sense making before the stress of that particular situation emerges. And we can then, if we can't do those two things, potentially control the stress associated with that situation. And there are a range of assets that we have available to us, or resources that we might have available to us to deal with that. Social, psychological, physical assets. And what is important then is how well that works. And so the extent to which some sort of response attenuates that stress becomes really important. One of the big challenges then is to integrate this into a system, and not only into operations, but into the strategic leadership and organisational change of the organisation, certainly into training and exercising, and then potentially into aims and into the associated systems that exist above the IMT. And this is something that that takes time, I think, and in many respects, this research that has occurred already is only starting to scratch the surface of some of these challenges. When you get to a training level, then the sorts of approaches that are likely to work are approaches that include classroom teaching and theoretical material, but it also include practice and feedback, whether that's in simulation. But then a continual reinforcement loop that actually brings that learning back into the workplace. And that's really important. And I know that there are a lot of agencies that are doing this better and better, and there are also resources that AFAC itself have been developing that are supporting that particular activity. So in terms of research findings, we find that the complexity, uncertainty, the autonomy and span of control and time pressure issues really lead to the need for some simple decision tools to support performance in this domain. Presented some of the research around coping and how that might be integrated into emergency management, but that needs to occur across multiple levels of organisations and to close the loop between training and actual performance. And so today I've just presented a very small component of that research around this particular framework. So that's it for me, Tanya. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben. Just some quick questions. How do the results that you found compare with what's already known? What was the state of knowledge like for this research that you're undertaking?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as Christine pointed out earlier, the state of knowledge of research above the IMT is relatively poor. I think that there's been great work done by a range of different people. I loved Cynthia Renault's work, Training at the Edge of Chaos stuff, which really talks about how far or how close to chaos we need to become in our training systems in order to replicate what actually happens, particularly in out-of-scale events. So there's definitely good research out there, but there's definitely a whole lot of opportunity and a whole lot of need for further research around how effective any of these tools might be in the context of strategic management of emergencies, around the effectiveness of training systems in order to achieve any sort of change. And I note that comment from Mick, I think, that was talking about quantitative and qualitative measures, and there's still a whole lot of work that needs to be done in that area in terms of integration between the various parts of the system. So I think there's still a long way to go in this area.
But the research that's available, is that enough to apply to emergency management right now, with the understanding that we'll need to continue to improve knowledge and application into the future? And what actions are needed now based on the research that you've done?
Yeah, look, you you're potentially talking about very complex journeys of change for major organisations that are incredibly complex. And when you think of it in those terms, it's a multi-year a journey that is being undertaken, because not only do organisations need to manage that change process in terms of culture, in terms of systems and processes, we're potentially asking questions then about what is it that's meant to exist in terms of aims beyond and above the IMT. So there's lots of work to be done, and I think that it's going to take a whole lot more research. But then that's a biased opinion because I'm an emergency management researcher, so I would say that, wouldn't I?
The researcher always says we need more research. Thanks, Ben. We'll leave it there. And we're now able to bring Chris back. We did have one question that Ben alluded to that was sent in by Mick that we thought that we'd get Chris to speak to as well. So welcome back, Chris. We've had a question sent through from Mick. How do you quantitatively and qualitatively measure your outcomes in terms of successful changes to incident management?
I would just like to say that I do apologise for the fire test. That was completely unexpected, and we weren't required to evacuate the building. So we're not sitting here while everybody else has left. So we weren't required to evacuate.
So you have followed appropriate emergency management procedures. So
I have. That's right. Yes. So I have.
Excellent. So go on.
So there's a number of ways that you can evaluate the performance of something. You can either do it through, or you can do it through both outcome and process measures. And in emergency services, a lot of the measures that people use tend to be driven by outcomes, as Chris was talking about earlier. And the outcomes would be things like how large the fire got, how many houses were lost, what land, etc., etc. Well, the outcomes are important, and obviously they're very important in looking at how to evaluate performance, but we also need to consider these process measures in order to be able to really effectively evaluate performance. And often there's a disconnect between the process and the outcome. So you can have a great outcome in a fire context. The rain might come along and put out the fire, but you've had a terrible process. The wheels could have completely fallen off, and people are having a go at each other left, right, and centre. And conversely, you can have a great process, but you can have a bad outcome, and again, for reasons that you just can't control. There could be a sudden wind change. All kinds of things can influence that outcome. So we also need to think about these process measures. And that's something that we're considering within the new research that we're doing. And I noticed that a few of the people here today are involved in that new research. So the new research that we're doing is really about looking at how we can develop some of these process measures in order to more effectively evaluate performance.
Okay, thanks for that, Chris, and thanks for coming back to answer that question. Before we hear from our lead end user, we're going to do a quick poll just to see how people will use the information and the research that they've heard about today. So with this poll that's coming on the screen in a moment, you'll be able to answer more than one option. And we're not asking you to make a commitment, it's just giving us a gauge of how you feel you use the research. So in which ways could you begin to use what you've heard today? Could you share and discuss with colleagues and stakeholders? Use the findings to inform policy and practice in your organisation, develop and strengthen relationships with other agencies, or learn more about how you can apply this work in your team and with other teams. And we'll give it a few seconds more. And we'll leave it there. It's interesting, those poll results, you know, they show the importance of engaging with stakeholders, which very much, that teamwork between different agencies is very much a theme of today's research. Now, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our lead end user. We're going to hear from Geoff Conway. He's an acting lead end user. He's appearing here today on behalf of Liam Fogarty from the Department of Environment and primary industries. Thanks for joining us, Geoff. So I just wanted to start off by asking, what benefits do you see for the industry in this research, and what do you think needs to occur within fire agencies and emergency management to take it into policy and practice?
Thanks, Tanya. Look, this research has been extraordinarily valuable, and it's highlighted a huge number of ideas and issues, as you've seen from the comments by our researchers. But the things that have really stood out to those of us in the industry are most pointedly the gaps and inconsistencies in our operational doctrine at those levels beyond the incident. And we really do understand now that the tasks that you undertake at a regional and state level are substantially different to what you would have undertaken as an incident manager, and you need to make that leap when you come into this particular area. So that really stands out for us quite clearly. And a direct flow on from that, of course, is we need to understand the roles that are played by individuals, either in a leadership role or when they're pursuing some sort of functional role at that state or regional level. So those things have come clear to us. One thing that's come out from all three of our researchers is the reinforcing of the importance of that common and shared situational awareness, and that we need to be sensitive to those circumstances where we may have not got a shared common situational awareness. So it's something that's got to exist across agencies and across levels in emergency management. And all of the researchers have made that particularly clear. And how we use it, well, the key themes come out in relation to how we prepare and continually develop our people. So training, professional development, exercising are all areas where we've got to start applying this. But we've also got to start thinking about how we review our performance, and that last question in relation to evaluating whether we've made worthwhile changes is really worthwhile. So after action reviews, operational reviews and so on all need to start reflecting what our researchers have been talking about.
Are there any barriers to making that happen?
Well, one of the things that's come very consistently, and I think Ben summarised it so well, we work in a phenomenally complex environment, and the person who's not familiar with emergency management would struggle to appreciate some of those complexities. So there's the first barrier that we've got to deal with. It's not easy to do what we do. There's a huge range of inputs, some of which we can control, some of which we can't. So those sorts of things are barriers. There's a wealth of other tasks that we've got to invest in developing our people. This is just one more area where our people have to develop their skills, their understanding and their aptitude to undertake their roles. And most people who are involved in managing emergencies have also got broader responsibilities within their agencies. So this is not the only thing they do. It's a very important part of what they do. It's not the only thing they're doing. So you've got to balance the time constraints there as well.
And I guess the nature of emergencies is that you can't incorporate them into planning.
Well, you can't, although very interestingly, many years ago in the old days of the Victorian Railways, they had a committee for unplanned events, which was rather a curious title for their committee, but it was all about managing emergencies. And I think most emergency services understand this is going to be part of their job. Predicting when it's going to be part of their job is not as certain.
Yeah. We had a question that was sent in by Brian. Recent coronials have identified management training as a major deficit in the emergency agency's response. What role do you see the vocational education and training system, that sector, playing in this level of education and training?
I think Brian's touched on a really important point. The vocational education training system is very much driven by competencies, and the vast majority of competencies that have been developed in this country relate quite directly to incident management. There are some which address the higher level responsibilities of people operating within agencies, but the emergency management role doesn't feature strongly. So there are limits on what VET can play here. I think agency and jurisdictional professional development programs and exercise programs are probably going to be more fertile ground for this research application in the initial stages. As time goes on, there's opportunities in VET, but certainly PD programs, review programs and exercising are really where we can get some significant change quickly.
Okay, we'll leave it there, Geoff. Thank you for your answers and your insights. Before we wind up, we're now going to revisit that first poll that we had at the start of today's presentation after the video, just to see how much you've learnt today. How much do you think you understand about multi-agency management coordination at regional and state levels? And we'll give that a few seconds more. Okay, and we'll leave that poll there. I'm delighted to see that no one ticked nothing. So we've seen a bit of a shift in the bell curve towards the bottom, more knowledgeable screen. So we always like to see that. Before we wind up, before we bring the forum to a close, we're just going to have all of the researchers and presenters back to the screen now, just to give their parting takeaway comments. We'll start off with you, Christine. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience? Oh, Christine, I'll just get you to start that again and make sure your microphone's on.
Sorry, thank you. I think that within the emergency management at all levels, not just strategic level, we're entering into new territory. We have increasing interdependencies, increasing risks and vulnerabilities, and so the importance of preparing people to face those kinds of conditions becomes crucial. And so I think there's a lot of work yet to be done in terms of the capability development and in terms of evaluating and measuring both progress and outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Chris?
I think as we've been discussing, the emergency management is a very complex and dynamic situation. And in that context, breakdowns and disconnects will occur. What we need to focus on is how to identify and resolve these disconnects more quickly than what we are. And that's part of the new research that we're going to be continuing on with. And that's particularly important as we face bigger and larger bushfires in more complex environments that potentially overwhelm people.
And Ben?
Yeah, look, the main thing I wanted to say was that in such a short presentation as this, it's hard to give people the overall breadth of the research that's been conducted, and I would really encourage people to go to the Bushfire CRC website, to go to AFAC and the materials that have been generated in terms of a research utilisation in this space, because there's a wealth of material there that people can use to help them apply some of this learning in their operational context.
Thanks, Ben. And yeah, on that point, the fire notes are available on the Bushfire CRC website, so it's well worth visiting at a later date. And Geoff, the lead end user always gets final say.
Thanks, Tanya. We know that we're going to be confronting more and more extreme weather events which generate emergencies. We know those events are going to be more extreme than what we've been seeing in the past. That science is well established. How we prepare and respond to those is going to be a real challenge, and this research helps us understand some of the difficulties we have as human beings in doing that. But if we're going to protect the communities that we serve, we've got to get good at this, and the research is an incredibly valuable way of us understanding what the job is and finding ways to get better at what we do. It's never ending and will never be good enough, but this is a great way to start.
Great. Thank you, Geoff. Well, that brings today's forum to a close. So thank you to the presenters, Christine, Chris, Ben and to Geoff for their insights, and of course to you, the audience, for listening and for your participation. We encourage you to visit the website. It's at www.bushfirecrc.com, where in the coming days we'll make today's presentations and video available and the related reports and fire notes can also be found on the website. Do encourage your colleagues who may have missed out today to log on at a later date and watch the forum. And if you have the time, please do stay online for a brief exit survey. We'd really appreciate it if people could take the time to provide feedback. Our next webinar forum will be Thinking Under Fire, which will explore important psychological aspects of bushfire incidents and emergency management, such as the influence of stress on information processing and decision making. And this will take place on Tuesday the 21st of October. Keep an eye on the Bushfire CRC website for details, or leave a comment in the exit survey if you'd like to be included on the mailing list for future online forums. On behalf of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project and its partners, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.